In 1959, the United States Army began building a city inside a glacier. 21 tunnels, 200 men, a nuclear reactor behind a wall of packed snow. On paper, a research station. In the war plans, 600 missiles were to stand in those tunnels, shuttled in secret from one launch point to another beneath the snow. Half a century later, a plane carrying radar flew the same coast and saw, under 3,000 feet of ice, a near-perfect circle 19 miles across. No human being has ever laid eyes on that crater. None ever will. And the loudest Greenland find of them all spent 50 years in a freezer in a Danish laboratory, in a box nobody opened. Inside were leaves. The map of Earth is finished. That is what we have all come to assume. Satellites hang over every point. Aerial surveys are public. The coordinates of any rock are 1 second away, and nothing is left blank. Are you sure there is no land on this planet whose shape we mapped later than the surface of Mars? The second question comes from school. The name of the island usually gets one sentence. Eric the Red called it the Greenland to lure settlers across the water, and the whole thing was a sales trick. Are you sure it was a trick? The third question is harder. Ice, to you, is frozen water, a substance with no content, a hazard for shipping. Are you ready for the fact that it holds, line by line, the composition of the air for every single year of the last 100,000, and that the record is being erased right now, with no copy anywhere? We start with the place they take tourists. The town of Ilulissat sits on the west coast of Greenland, about 190 miles north of the Arctic Circle. 4,500 people live there. It is the third largest settlement in the country, with an airport, hotels, and boats for visitors. In Greenlandic, the name means icebergs, and it means it literally. The bay in front of the town gets so packed with ice that for weeks on end, you cannot see the water underneath. The ice comes down a fjord that runs inland from the town for about 30 miles. In 2004, the fjord went onto the UNESCO World Heritage List with a wording you can hear nothing through. An outstanding example of an active glacial process. The process has a name. The ice is pushed here by Jakobshavn Glacier, which Greenlanders call Sermik Kujalik. It dumps more ice into the sea than any other glacier in the northern hemisphere. About 7% of everything the island loses goes out through this one gate. It moves fast enough to see without instruments. The front advances up to 130 feet in a day, a distance you would cover on foot in 30 seconds. Stand at the edge, count 50 paces back, come again tomorrow. It will be where you stood. You hear it for miles. First, a dry crack like a gunshot. Then a low rumble that arrives through the water and comes up into the soles of your feet. The iceberg rolls over and throws a wave, and in the villages along the shore, people drag their boats higher up the beach. The big blocks stand 300 feet above the surface, and several times that is hidden below it. It looks as though the ice goes straight out into the open ocean from here. At the mouth of the fjord lies an underwater sill, a rock ridge about 800 feet down. The biggest ones ground and stop. Some wait years, until they melt away enough underneath to float free, or until the pressure of new ice behind them shoves them off the ridge. The bay from the postcards works as a holding pen. There is a version in which the iceberg that opened the side of the Titanic on the night of April 15th, 1912, came out of this fjord. It cannot be checked. What is known is this. A block of Greenland ice reaches the waters off Newfoundland in 2 or 3 years, and the Labrador Current carries such blocks straight onto the shipping lanes. Nobody weighed that iceberg or dated it. Nobody established where it came from, and the photographs that get called its portrait are argued over to this day. The glacier does not wander. It runs along a deep trough cut into the bedrock, and that trough carries on under the ice sheet further than anyone can follow from the air. Once we learned to see the whole island through its ice, it turned out there are many such grooves down there. One of them does not fit anything we thought we knew about the shape of land. You look through ice with radar. The plane flies low along straight lines. The antenna fires a pulse downward. Part of the signal bounces off the boundary between ice and rock and comes back a few millionths of a second late. The delay gives you the thickness. Flight after flight, line after line, for decades. NASA's Operation Icebridge logged thousands of hours over Greenland. And by 2013, there was enough data to stitch it all into one picture. Bamber's group stitched it. A valley showed up in the bedrock of the island, about 460 miles long. The Grand Canyon runs 277 miles. This one is nearly twice that, up to 2,600 feet deep, and in places 6 miles wide, with walls almost as tall as the tallest building on Earth. And all of it sits under a lid of ice. No one has seen this canyon, and no one will. You cannot climb down into it. There is between half a mile and 2 miles of ice on top, and that ice moves. A borehole drilled today stops being straight within a few years and closes completely within a few decades. Everything we know about the canyon is indirect, from a returned signal, from calculation, from readings of different instruments laid over one another. A groove that size should have been cut by a glacier. The walls say otherwise. The canyon is older than the ice sheet. It was carved by a river running over open ground, when there was no glacier here at all. It runs from the middle of the island to the northern coast, which means it worked as a single drainage system with a mouth at the end. In 2017, a team led by Morligam assembled a sharper map of the bed beneath the ice, and the canyon was still on it. The canyon still drains. Meltwater from the base of the ice sheet runs north along it. And here, a question arrives that is hard to answer straight away. Where does liquid water at the bottom of a glacier come from? When the temperature down there is below freezing and 2 miles of ice press on it from above, the pressure is half the answer. Ice under load melts below zero, and under 2 miles of it, the melting point drops by roughly 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The other half comes from below, out of the Earth's crust. Heat from the interior keeps flowing upward, and the ice above works as a blanket. It seals the bed off from whatever is happening at the surface. The surface is another story. The summit of the sheet has recorded minus 93 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 69.6 Celsius, a record for the whole northern hemisphere. At that temperature, your breath freezes as it leaves you and falls, as grit you can hear landing. Rubber cracks, diesel thickens into jelly, bare metal tears the skin off your fingers on contact. All of this goes on 2 miles above lakes, where the water stays liquid. The sheet covers about 80% of the island, some 660,000 square miles, 3 times the size of France. In the center, it comes close to 2 miles thick. Stack 9 Eiffel Towers on top of each other, and the top one barely reaches the surface of the ice, with ordinary rock lying under all of it. Several dozen lakes have been found down there. The number grows with every survey. This is where the first question turns an awkward side toward you. The coordinates of any rock really are 1 second away, and yet 80% of this island has a lid on it up to 2 miles thick, and under that lid, they keep finding objects the size of a city. Nobody has been down. Inside those lakes, the darkness is total, and light does not get through the first few hundred feet of ice. The pressure at the bottom would flatten a man in ordinary gear. That water has not seen the sky in tens of thousands of years, the entire span of cave painting as we know it. A lake under ice is easy to picture as still. There are known cases where the ice above one suddenly sagged into an enormous bowl, and the water drained down and sideways in a matter of weeks. So it moves, and as it spreads across the rock floor, it greases the soul of the glacier and takes the friction away. From one dark lake, step back to the movement of the whole sheet. The speed at which ice slides into the sea is settled down at the bottom, at the boundary with rock, and it depends on how much water is there and how it spreads across an uneven floor. In the north of the island, there is a glacier where this mechanism showed itself most plainly. It is called Petermann. Petermann Glacier reaches the sea at the far northwest of Greenland, on the strait that separates the island from Canada's Ellesmere Island. Nobody lives within hundreds of miles. The glacier ends in a floating tongue. The ice leaves the rock floor and carries on over water. with several hundred feet of sea underneath it. Until 2010, that tongue ran about 40 miles out from the shore. The name came from a man who was never here. August Petermann was a German cartographer who drew maps of the Arctic through the 19th century, outfitted other men's expeditions, and was convinced that an ice-free sea lay around the pole and only needed to be reached. He was wrong. The expeditions he sent ran into ice and came home with losses, and his name ended up on a glacier that became a symbol of the opposite process. In August 2010, a slab broke off the Petermann tongue, about 100 square miles of it. 4 Manhattans floating out to sea as one sheet. Then another. 2 years later, a second block calved, half the size of the first, and the floating tongue lost nearly half its length, which it has never grown back. A break that size ought to raise the level of the ocean. Floating ice has already displaced its own volume of water, so when it melts, the level does not change, and the schoolroom experiment with a glass and an ice cube holds at the scale of a fjord too. The tongue matters for a different reason. It props up the ice that still rests on rock and has never been in the ocean. While the cork holds, the glacier behind it moves more slowly. The cork blew out. The tide lifts and drops this tongue twice a day, and the line where the ice parts from the seabed walks back and forth with it. Atlantic water comes in underneath, barely 2 degrees above freezing. That is enough. It eats channels into the underside of the tongue. Standing on the surface, you would see nothing but a flat white field, and you would hear cracking under your boots every few minutes. This is where the term zombie ice comes from. It describes masses that are doomed to melt under warming that has already happened, even if the warming stopped today. They still lie in place and still look like an ordinary glacier, but the link to the snowfall that fed them is broken, and there is nothing left to restore it with. By one estimate published in 2022, that doomed ice on its own is enough to raise the world ocean by close to 11 inches. 11 inches everywhere at once. On a low, flat coast, that means the water walks tens of yards inland and never goes back. Here, the ice explains everything. The speed of the glaciers, the volume that leaves every summer, the future of coastlines on the far side of the world. Go south. 900 miles down the same island, there's a place where the ice explains almost nothing. The south of Greenland looks nothing like a glacier. Fjords, green slopes, sheep out grazing. A short summer that reaches 50 degrees. This is where Eric the Red, outlawed from Iceland for a string of killings, brought his settlers in the year 985. 25 ships left Iceland. 14 arrived. The Norse lived here for more than 400 years, nearly twice as long as the United States has existed. They set up 2 colonies. The eastern settlement lay in the south, the western settlement near what is now Nuuk, 300 miles further up the coast. Archaeologists count around 500 farmsteads in all, and the population in the best years is put at somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 people. They kept cows and sheep, built in turf and stone, paid a church tithe, and buried their dead as Christians. Of all of it, the church at Valsey survived best. Walls of undressed stone are still standing, higher than a man, roughly 50 feet by 25. There is no roof. The wood went, the stone stayed. Grass grows inside, and in summer sheep graze between the walls, animals brought to this country many centuries after the last parishioner walked out the door. The last record of living Greenland Norse is a wedding in that church in 1408. It was described in letters by Icelanders who were blown off course, ended up here, and later made it home. After that, silence. Not one document, not one dated grave, not one report of how or where several thousand people went. The western settlement emptied earlier, around the middle of the 14th century. A surviving account from those years says the man sent to check on it found the houses intact and the livestock wandering loose, with no people alive or dead. No fight, no mass graves, no fire. An empty settlement with everything still standing in its place. For a long time, the explanation looked obvious. It got cold. From the 14th century, the North Atlantic slid into what is called the Little Ice Age. Summers shortened, Cattle stopped putting on weight. The strait choked with ice. Work by Dugmore and his colleagues shows something more tangled. The soils were exhausted by grazing, and all that time the Norse had Inuit neighbors who were doing fine in the same conditions because they fed themselves from the sea rather than from pasture. Then, in 2016, an article by Kintish put forward a version that turns the whole story around. The Greenland colonies may have held on mainly as a hunting outpost. The main export was walrus ivory, carved in Europe into knife handles, chess pieces, and church fittings. When African elephant ivory started reaching European ports again, Greenland walrus tusk lost its value. The market closed. The reason to hang on at the end of the world went with the price. Some researchers allow that the Norse may have gathered themselves and left by ship in an orderly way, with nobody remaining in Greenland to write the departure down. Nothing here is known for certain. No skeletons have been found with signs of mass starvation. No cemetery from the final years. Not a single record of the last ships. 5 centuries after the wedding at Valsey, an American came north. He wanted one thing. He gave 23 years to it and paid with 8 of his toes, and the land that now carries his name turned out to be the strangest ground on the planet. Robert Peary served in the Navy and went to the Arctic from the 1880s on, losing 8 frostbitten toes after one wintering. In 1909, he announced that he had reached the North Pole. The claim is still disputed. His navigation figures do not add up, and nobody qualified to check them was standing beside him. The argument stays open. The name stuck to the map anyway, and Peary Land is now the northern tip of Greenland, beyond the 82nd parallel. This is the northernmost ice-free land on Earth. Bare rock and nothing else. 22,000 square miles, near enough the size of Croatia. From its northern edge to the pole is a little over 400 miles. 2 hours of flying, except there is nowhere to fly to. Only drifting sea ice that is here today and somewhere else tomorrow. The easy explanation would be that it must be warmer up there. Summers here do reach 50 degrees, winters go past 20 below, nothing exceptional. The reason is different. Precipitation runs under 2 inches a year, less than that in places, and snow has nothing to build a glacier out of. Over a whole year, the sky drops a layer of water no thicker than your little finger. In moisture terms, this is drier than the Sahara. A polar desert looks the part. Bare gravel broken by frost into regular polygons, thin cushions of moss in the hollows, streams that run 3 weeks a year. There is no smell at all, nothing to rot, and nothing to rot it, since bacteria barely work in that cold. Sound travels a long way and comes back, and after a few minutes of silence, you start to hear your own pulse. People were here. Archaeologists find camps around 4,500 years old, where tiny bands of hunters reached the northernmost land, lived a few generations, and vanished, leaving hearths and arrowheads behind them. Peary Land now sits inside Northeast Greenland National Park, the largest on the planet, about 375,000 square miles, close to the area of Egypt. Nobody lives in the park. You can only get in with permission from the Danish authorities, by helicopter or by sledge with a military patrol. And if something goes wrong, help arrives in days rather than hours. The first question closes here. Open ground, no ice, no forest, no water over it. And in a whole year, fewer people cross it than pass through one train station in an hour. 600 miles to the southwest, under the edge of another glacier, lies a shape that has no business on land. A regular circle, 19 miles across, with a raised rim and a drop in the middle. No river cuts that. What leaves a mark like this on a planet? An impact leaves a mark like that. In 2018, a group under the geologist Kjær published a paper on an impact crater beneath Hiawatha Glacier in northwest Greenland. 19 miles from rim to rim. You would need a good half hour on a highway to drive from one side of it to the other. The floor sits about 1,000 feet below the rim, and a stone drop from the edge would fall for 8 seconds. They found it the way they found the canyon, with radar from a plane. A special aircraft was flown over this patch of ice because the edge of the glacier looked suspiciously round in the images. Through up to 3,000 feet of ice, the radar showed a bowl with a raised ring wall and a central peak, a shape that on Earth comes only from an impact. Then came the sand. A stream running out from under the glacier carried quartz grains with shock deformation and particles rich in iron. By calculation, the object was an iron asteroid about a mile across. Nothing like it has been watched by human beings, and nobody would want to watch it. Go there and you see nothing. A flat white field, wind, a crust that breaks under your boot by the width of a hand, and not the faintest hint that a 19-mile crater lies under your soles. The first age estimates ranged from a few million years down to 12,000. The lower bound would put the impact in a time when people were already alive, hunting and painting on walls. In the arguments around this crater, the suggestion has come up regularly that the strike caused the sharp, cold snap about 12,000 years ago that cut off the warming after the Ice Age. Nothing direct was ever found. In 2022, Kenny's team dated material from the crater by two independent methods. 58 million years. The asteroid landed 8 million years after the dinosaurs disappeared, on a continent covered in forest with no ice on it whatsoever. Everything a person might have connected to this impact was canceled by one line in a table of dates. Radar had flown this coast before. Half a century before those flights, people came onto the same ice with a completely different job. They intended to live inside it, and they brought a nuclear reactor with them. In 1959, the engineering units of the United States Army started building 125 miles from Thule Air Base, at about 6,500 feet above sea level, in the middle of the ice sheet. The method was simple. Heavy snow-cutting machines sliced trenches into the surface. Steel arches went over the top. Snow drifted across the arches, and within a few months the site did not exist for any observer looking down from above. What they got was a town. 21 tunnels running about 2 miles in total, 30 football fields laid end to end. Living quarters, a mess hall, a hospital, a library, a movie theater, a chapel, a barber shop. Up to 200 men were there at any one time. Power and heat came from a portable nuclear reactor assembled on site out of parts shipped in piece by piece and started up in 1960. In official statements, Camp Century was a polar research station, and science really was done there. Documents from the Army engineers, declassified later, showed the second job. Project Iceworm called for cutting a network of tunnels thousands of miles long into the ice and placing 600 ballistic missiles inside it, movable between launch points so that an adversary would never know where they were standing at any given moment. Denmark, which owns the island, had by then declared its territory free of nuclear weapons. Nobody told Copenhagen. The Danish government was not fully informed about the reactor or the missile plan, which a Danish Foreign Ministry report admitted in 2016. Living in that town was hard. There was no day at all. Under the snow, an electric light of constant brightness burned around the clock, and the clocks showed a time that matched nothing outside. The reactor and the diesels hummed without stopping. The walls sweated, the ceilings dripped, and at night the ice cracked loudly enough to keep new arrivals awake. The military treated the ice sheet as a foundation you could build on like ground. Ice under load flows. The tunnel walls crept inward, the ceilings began to sink, and within a year of startup crews with milling machines, were shaving off the excess ice continuously to win the passages back. By 1962, some rooms had been crushed. The reactor was dismantled and taken out in 1964, and the camp was abandoned for good in 1967. Almost everything was left inside. By published estimates, some 55,000 gallons of diesel fuel, wastewater, construction debris, and low-level radioactive waste. The assumption was that snow would keep burying it forever. Before the shutdown, in 1966, a hole was drilled here all the way to the bottom of the sheet. 4,500 feet of ice, almost a mile, 15 minutes of steady walking stood on end. It was the first borehole in the world to pass through an ice sheet entirely to the bedrock beneath and bring up an unbroken column covering its whole history. Below the ice, the drill took another 11 feet of frozen ground. Just dirt. 600 missiles, 21 tunnels, 200 men, a nuclear reactor, snow-cutting machines, and plans that even the country owning the island was not told about. What survived the whole project was 11 feet of frozen dirt in a cardboard box. The core was pulled up, sawn into sections. Some samples were studied in the 70s, and then the interest ran out. The ice part went off to keep working, and the lower sediment footage was sent into storage. The boxes moved from laboratory to laboratory, crossed the Atlantic, and settled in the 90s into a freezer in Denmark, where they were put on a shelf and stopped appearing in reports. For 50 years, somebody paid the electricity. Nobody opened the freezer. In 2017, the freezers were being moved. Boxes marked Camp Century came out. Inside were glass jars of frozen ground, lifted from under almost a mile of ice. They went for analysis to a group that included the geologist Christ, who thawed the sediment out and washed it through with water. In the residue lay twigs, leaves, fragments of moss, seeds, and parts of insects. The plant material had kept its cell structure, and under a microscope you can see the veins on a leaf. The paper came out in 2021, and the conclusion in it was plain. The place where a military camp was later built had once been tundra, with mosses, dwarf shrubs, and a short, wet summer. No ice at all. One question was left. When? In 2023, the same group published a date obtained from the luminescence of mineral grains, a method that shows how long a grain has gone without seeing sunlight. The answer is about 416,000 years. Our own species did not exist then, and the first people of modern build were still more than 100,000 years away. The second question closes here. A name that was taken for 5 centuries as the sales pitch of a crafty Icelander turned out to be an accurate description of the place, for an epoch that Eric the Red could know nothing whatever about. Then comes the part that keeps this find in the conversation. The warm period in which northwest Greenland lost its ice was an ordinary interglacial, and the amount of carbon dioxide in the air was lower then than it is now. A sheet assumed to be stable for millions of years was disappearing in conditions milder than today's. By the calculation in that same paper, melting this one region alone meant a rise in the ocean of at least 4.5 feet, chest deep on an adult, and it does not recede. The Army drilled the ice to find out how it behaves, so that it could build missile tunnels inside it and hide them from the other side of the world. The tunnels lasted 3 years. What survived the project was the proof that all this ice once disappeared completely. Those leaves reached us only because somebody paid the electric bill on a freezer for 50 years, and the box stood in the dark at a steady minus. The natural archive holding everything else will not be moved into a freezer. There is nowhere to move it. The Greenland sheet is built as a stack of annual layers. Snow settles differently in winter and in summer. The layers differ in density and in crystal size, and in the upper part of a core, you can count them by eye, like rings on a cut tree. Air's locked inside. Each bubble holds the actual air of that year, caught physically at the moment the snowflakes closed over and cut it off from the atmosphere. Cores give up volcanic ash, with a date of eruption, desert dust, soot from forest fires, lead from Roman smelters, radioactive isotopes from the tests of the 50s and 60s. All of it in order. The deepest Greenland boreholes reach ice about 120,000 years old, and from those layers, we have reconstructed temperatures, the composition of the atmosphere, and the sharp climate breaks of the past, which we would otherwise know nothing about. Destroying that record is simple. When the surface thaws in summer, water seeps down and refreezes inside the mass, gluing neighboring layers into one. The boundaries between years blur. Where melting happens every summer, there is nothing left to read, and nothing can restore what is blurred, because there is no second copy of these lines in any archive on the planet. A second record is disappearing at the same time, one nobody drilled for. Inuit place names are tied to the state of the ice. This headland is named for the edge where the shore-fast ice used to form, this channel for the point where a sledge route came ashore. The routes depended on sea ice that arrived by a certain week and stood for months. Now it comes late and thin. The number of sled dogs in the country has fallen by roughly half in 2 decades. Hunters who have walked on ice since childhood have stopped trusting their own experience because that experience describes ice that is no longer there. The names stay in the language and stop pointing at anything on the ground. The third question can be closed. Greenland ice turned out to be the only existing copy of a document with a line for every year of the last 100,000, and part of those lines has already been erased for good. One thing we will never know: the ice that melted over the past few decades had its own layers, with its own air, its own dust, and its own dates. What was written there? Nobody will say, "You cannot read a burned volume," even knowing exactly which shelf it stood on. Plenty in this story is disputed, and one piece of it we leave to you. Where did the Greenland Norse go? Cold and hunger, as everyone assumed for 100 years, or an orderly departure by ship once walrus ivory stopped paying? Write in the comments. Which version seems more plausible to you and why? If you want more work like this, subscribe to the channel.